Relatively new democracies apparently having difficulty.
We are at the turning point in history, whether democracy is winning or democracy is losing.
Hello and welcome to a special talk event on a very important subject, global democracy, its health, its future, and the implications for the Indo-Pacific region. I'm Jonathan Soble, former Tokyo bureau chief at the Financial Times, currently a partner at Kreab, Japan, a strategic communications firm here in Tokyo. Today, my co-host and commentator is Yuichi Hosoya, professor at Keio University and the head of the Keio Center for Strategy. Before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about the center?
Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction. We have established a new think tank within Keio University in March this year, Keio Center for Strategy. And the Keio Center for Strategy is trying to be a hub of researchers at Keio University, business community, as well as government institutions. By combining these talents, we are trying to create discussion, rich discussion within the think tank, both internally and internationally.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our special guest today. She's Maiko Ichihara. She's a professor at Hitotsubashi University, an expert on foreign policy, human rights, and democracy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, the question in our title is democracy in decline? Professor Ichihara, you are an expert on this subject. You've also translated Larry Diamond's book, Ill Winds, which is all about the decline of democracy. What's your answer?
Well, democracy in the international scene has actually improved since 1974 up until recently. And so we have seen some progress in democratization everywhere, for the past 40 years or so. However, since 2006, we have been unfortunately seeing what we call democracy's recession. The Indo-Pacific region is actually very unique in the sense that we have diverse type of political regimes from those outright autocracies like North Korea and China to those authoritarian countries that disguise as if they have actually free and fair elections, like those Indo-China countries, to those democratic countries that have been actually weakening their civil liberties inside of the countries like in Indonesia, India, the Philippines. And also, finally, we also have those democratic countries that are relatively resilient, like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan.
And what do you think accounts for the main difference between the resilient countries and the not so resilient countries?
Well, one of the things which have been said oftentimes is that those relatively new democracies tend to have weak institutions and also value commitment in terms of liberal values. And so those countries like Indonesia and the Philippines that are relatively new democracies are apparently having difficulty actually consolidating the commitment to democracy. But what we have been seeing in the international scene outside the Asian region is that even those developed democracies have been weakening their institutions and also norm commitment, like the United States and European countries.
Professor Hosoya, what do you think? Democratic recession?
Right. I think that Ichihara-san mentioned very important things. We are now at a critical moment in world history. After the end of the Cold War, we thought at the beginning that the democracy was going to spread globally, and we thought that based upon the democracy, we thought we could enjoy peace and stability after at the end of the Cold War. But now we are seeing many wars and conflicts. Why? At the same time, we are seeing the decline of democracy, particularly after Russian invasion to Ukraine, as well as some of the Chinese military activities surrounding Japan. We are totally disillusioned by the facts that we are facing. So in the sense, as Prime Minister Kishida has been saying this year, we are at the turning point in history, whether democracy is winning or democracy is losing. At least in the last several years, we are seeing the retreat of democracy. If democracy is going to retreat for decades, we will see totally different kind of international order in future. In the sense, we really need to have resilient democracy in ourselves.
And I really want to talk about how we can build that,
Right.
and what the role of the public sector and the private sector can be in that. First, I want to touch a little bit more on the reasons, though. I mean, you mentioned outside actors, and you mentioned China and Russia, but you also talked about weakness inside democratic countries. It's very tempting to blame China and Russia, for example, for the fractions that we see inside other societies, right? Whether they're established democracies or new ones, but they're really just exploiting problems that are already there. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, that is indeed. The most concerning thing indeed, in democracy is the rise of populism. This is especially the case that, with the spread of globalization and also neoliberal economic policies, the gap in economy has been expanding in every country. And those who have been sort of in a difficult position economically in terms of education or what have you, have been exhorting to various means. One of them is actually to sort of support those populist leaders who are going anti-establishment so that they can, go about institutions and establishments to start some new policies. And those people, those populist leaders, tend to be authoritarian in characters, in a sense that they try to implement something on their own initiative, and they claim that they are the ones that can, who can implement those policies by themselves. And also, they tend to have nativist sort of approaches, which is that they try to create some enemies inside of their countries, for example, amongst those immigrants or those who do not, share the ethnic background, religious background, and so forth.
Your particular interest really is disinformation, what you call the narrative war, right? And I'm wondering, if this is a war between authoritarian forces and liberal democratic forces, both within countries and among them, who's winning and why?
Well, it's really hard to tell who's winning, and I do not think that either side of winning. I say this because influence operations of authoritarian countries, which is to try to distort information to win behaviors and policy changes of other countries, can be considered effective only when we see some big problems, like Trump's winning in 2016 elections, for example, or Brexit in Britain. But as far as we do not see that kind of problem, we tend to think that actually those influence operations are nothing. Well, they may be doing something, but we don't have to care. Well, the issue, the reality is actually different. We have to worry about multiple things. Russia and China are the main actors in this field, but they tend to use different methodologies. Russia traditionally has been using much more aggressive sort of methodologies, such as massive amount of spread of disinformation, which is called the fire hose of falsehood. And they also even sometimes conduct assassination of some of the activists, for example. And China used not to do that. Their traditional tactics is to create their own narratives in a way that people outside of the countries can be pro-China and support Chinese CCP propaganda. And for that sake, they have been also training journalists, police officers, and legal professionals in their country, inviting them from Asia and Africa to China. But recently, we have been seeing sort of change in China's influence operations in a way that China started using Russia-like tools. And one thing we can see is that China is said to have started to interfere into U.S. elections from 2022. while China was refraining from doing so up until 2020. And China's election interference into Southeast Asian countries has been also pretty strong. And well, in the Japanese society, we have recently seen a massive attack from China in terms of the discharge of treated water. And even before then, we saw the Russia and China's cooperation in terms of propaganda warfare related to Russian aggression of Ukraine.
Right. You mentioned the firehood of falsehood. That was a big issue as far back as 2016 election in the United States. Since then, there has been a range of attempts to deal with it, both from governments and from the social media platforms like Facebook that have ended up hosting the water from this fire hose. How do you judge whether how do you evaluate the effectiveness of these efforts so far?
Well, it's once again, it's very difficult to talk about the effectiveness. But one thing I will have to probably raise an issue is the impact onto intellectuals. Actually, this is the case of Russian propaganda campaign during the aggression into Ukraine. Well, Russian propaganda was spread not only by Russian state media and also Russian trolls, but also Chinese trolls as well as Japanese conspiracy theorists. And such kind of propaganda as NATO's eastward expansion was the reason why Russia went into Ukraine, or Ukraine actually had neo-Nazis who have been killing Russian residents in the country, have spread in the Japanese Twitter as well. And Russian embassy in Japan's Twitter account actually was one of the top 5 most popular Twitter accounts, well, during especially the early period of Russian aggression into Ukraine, and that was because of these, trolls' help, and that actually impacted those Japanese intellectuals who hope to see the termination of war in the region as soon as possible, and unfortunately, there rose whataboutist sort of discourse, and they started saying that, well, apparently Russian aggression of Ukraine is, violation of sovereignty, violation of human rights, and so forth, and so this is not justifiable. But United States, for example, went into Iraq in early 2000s and into Afghanistan, and so, well, we all have to blame each other, sort of discourse appeared. And well, that's considered as whataboutism, which was impacted by Russian propaganda. And I actually conducted, according to my research, I actually conducted a correspondence analysis of taking, some of the articles that shows whataboutism. And this graph actually shows the result of the, correspondence analysis. And the terminologies that cluster with each other closely are the terminologies that are used very frequently with each other. And I coded adjectives into positive adjectives and negative adjectives in order to understand what kind of adjectives those articles use. And the result shows that, well, apparently because these are articles that talk about Russian aggression of Ukraine, so they do talk about Russian Ukraine. As related actors, or the actors that have been supporting Ukraine, they talk about NATO and the West, for example. But unfortunately, as you can probably see, slightly negative terminologies are more often used when it comes to NATO and West. So they are showing slightly more negative images about those Western countries. And unfortunately, they also did not see that China as an actor. Well, as the graph shows, China is located pretty far from the core of the cluster of wars. That means that they were not aware about China's role in this propaganda warfare going on with the Russian aggression of Ukraine.
When we say disinformation, the first thing that comes to mind is lies, spreading things that are not factual. But of course, that's only part of what you call the narrative war. There's also using things that are true, like the U.S. invaded Iraq, and trying to turn the discourse around that and away from the subject at hand, right? Yeah. All right. You also mentioned Japan, both as having a role in this disinformation, being part of it, as well as being a target, right? The Fukushima water release, for example. How has Japan sort of reacted to this? I'd like to get both of your takes on that. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very interesting case. Apparently, those disinformation attack against the Japanese society was really harsh at the time of the discharging of treated water from the Fukushima area. And CCP has been actually conducting this narrative warfare related to this treated water from 2021. When former Prime Minister Suga announced that Japan is going to discharge the treated water, and from around July 2023, which was right before the discharge started, the campaign became much harsher, and various kinds of disinformation were out there. For example, one of the disinformation said Prime Minister Kishida had some seafood in Japan and then was hospitalized, or IAEA officials received some bribes from the Japanese government, created some false information about the tritium level of the treated water kind of thing, which were disinformation. And together with those, massive amount of phone calls from Chinese citizens, the entire Japanese society was under attack. And apparently, when those authoritarian actors tried to target some other societies with those, influence operations, one of the, purposes that they have is to divide the country and destabilize the country. So in this case, they probably tried to, divide between those stakeholders like fishermen and also those who were, going against the discharging of the treated water, and those people who supported the discharge. But the end result was that Japanese people started actually, making more tax contribution to the Fukushima area and purchasing more seafood from the Fukushima area. So they decided to go for supporting the Fukushima area. So instead of getting divided, within the Japanese society, what we saw was the integration of the society. And this has been actually kind of a traditional reaction that the Japanese society tends to have. Whenever we have some kind of political tensions, Japanese people are very reluctant about conducting boycotts, showing their criticisms or feelings of opposition and stuff. But they like to have boycotts. Buy things, boycotts, buy things and support things. So that was actually what we saw during the COVID as well. Many people purchased things from nearby stores, or they had a campaign of, let's support those restaurants in our neighborhood by buying some food from there and have those nice food at home and stuff.
First of all, so do you think that's a sign of the robustness of the democracy that we talked about, or should Japan be more worried about the potential immediate or longer-term effects of disinformation being caught up in the narrative war?
Right. Perhaps the both. I enjoy listening to what Ichihara-san is talking about, because these things are extremely important, but at the same time, these operations or activities are basically unseen and unnoticed by ordinary people. First of all, we need to learn what they are doing and what these activity means to us. So first of all, we need to learn these kind of realities, as well as the concepts, as well as those kind of the evolution of new methods. So this is one thing. The other thing is that the operations and authoritarian regimes are basically empowered by digitalized technologies, as well as SNS and AI and so on. These kind of recent developments. So with these recent developments of information and technologies, they are becoming more powerful than before. It means that we are becoming more vulnerable to these kind of operations. So we need to defend ourselves from those attacks, because those attacks are basically quite cheap unlike launching missiles, using nuclear weapons, and basically these are unseen. So these activities are often quite immune to criticisms or any counteractions. In the sense, we really need to learn many things, but today Ichihara-san has been talking about, and also we need to have much robust defense to these kind of realities.
So next year, I think, is an important year for democracy in the sense we have a couple of quite important elections in divided countries coming up, in the United States, but also in Taiwan, where influence operations from outside as well as internal fractures have been a major part of the picture. What should we expect in these two big events and broadly? I mean, taking a different form, more robust defenses. How's the narrative war going to shape up in the coming year or so?
In a sense, it's hard to see whether there is going to be a chaos over elections, because if, well, as Hosoya Sensei said, if we can, robustly defend ourselves, then we might not be subjected to influence operations too much. However, China has expanded its influence operations campaign all over the world. As I said, since last year, they have been entering into U.S. elections as well, and what we call Dragon Bridge, which used to conduct influence operations campaign over those Hong Kong democracy advocates. Are out there to intervene into U.S. elections, and also they have been quite active in trying to make impacts onto Southeast Asian countries' elections as well. And what they try to do is not only to support one type of candidate, but also to destabilize the target societies. And apparently Taiwan here is the most biggest victim of China's influence operations. Well, they think that there is a huge stake because China wants to integrate Taiwan in the future without hopefully using the military muscle. And so in here, narrative warfare is a very important one. Well, they are hoping that if they could make the Taiwanese people feel that they want to be a part of China without actual fighting, then that's the best for China. And so, election time is going to be used as such. But at the same time, as I said, the Taiwanese society as well as American society has been preparing very much for this kind of campaign. Well, one difficulty is that when there's a huge involvement of the government in tackling disinformation, it could actually potentially backfire. That's what we have been seeing in the United States. Well, those, especially Trump supporters, think that tackling disinformation is a way to sort of, repress the freedom of speech. And so in the House Judiciary Committee, they have been actually suing a lot of governmental officials, researchers, NGOs that have been working in the field of tackling disinformation. And so we also have to expect that if there is too much involvement of government into disinformation, protection of the society from disinformation in those countries at the time of elections, the same kind of thing could happen. So we have to pay attention to that.
And so, Professor Hosoya, I mean, is this an example of the difficulty that open democratic societies face in cracking down on disinformation?
Yeah, exactly. Let me place this issue in a little bit broader context. First of all, really, we are living in the time of the U.S.-China structural confrontation, and the front line is on Taiwan. It means that we have elections next year in United States and Taiwan, and these will definitely define the future course of international relations. But on the other hand, China doesn't have elections. So China is much more immune to foreign interference from foreign countries. So in a sense, if China can influence upon the direction of Taiwanese and the United States elections, of course, China wants it. And it will undoubtedly benefit to Chinese future foreign policy. So in a sense, I think that China will, or the Russia will escalate the degree of interference or influence operations in both in Taiwan and the United States, partly because it is quite probable that China feel that it is very costly to use its military muscle. So instead of using its own military muscle, they are tending to rely upon non-military tools to change the course of US-China confrontations. Of course, it would be influence operations or cyber attacks and so on. And the cyberspace is now becoming a main battleground between the United States and China, or between China and Taiwan. But these areas, of course, cannot be unseen to us. And it is really difficult to feel what's going on there. So in that sense, first of all, we need to look at what we cannot really see. And at the same time, we need to feel what they are doing in our own country, in the United States, in Japan, and in Taiwan, even though these are unseen. So in a sense, we are now living in a very difficult time to defend our society in a battle that we cannot see.
And if influence operations take advantage of existing divisions and existing weakness in democracies, then one counter to that, of course, is to strengthen democracy more fundamentally. I know, Professor Ichihara, you've looked at democracy movements around the world, how they can be strengthened and supported. What can Japan, for example, do? We're here in Japan in terms of its foreign policy or other ways to support democracy globally.
Well, what Japan can do, there are actually multiple things that Japan can do. Well, when it comes to protection of democracy in relations with influence operations, one of the things that we have to pay attention to is that influence operations could be effective only if the target country's society is divided. And so, those authoritarian actors that are trying to influence other countries, other societies, always try to push, hot button issues from both sides, and so so that we would have much controversies over gun control or over the discharging of the treated water and things like that. And so one of the important things that we should do as the Japanese society, as well as probably the Japanese government, would be to bridge the divide. Well, within Japan, within the Japanese society, as well as potentially in other countries' society as well. And providing economic support would be indeed one thing, to support those people who are suffering from the poverty, and also creating narratives that are trying to actually bridge the gap would be another thing. For example, the Taiwanese society has been having a very difficult time between the DPP side and KMT side. And they themselves have to think about how to bridge the two sides. But if the Japanese government could do something to help, talk between, facilitate talks between them, that would be one of the things. And also, given that democracies have been under recession, we have been seeing a lot of, for example, coups or repression of civil society activists, journalists, and so forth. And those people have been having difficulty living in their countries. And as the Japanese people, believing in the spontaneous movement for democracy as one of the important sort of factors to support those democracy movements, we have to keep in mind that supporting those people who have been trying to bring freedom, better protection of human rights, and accountability in their own country is very important for us. So, in person, I have been trying to create a network of scholars and NGOs in the Indo-Pacific field, region as a whole, so that we, the scholars, can host those democracy advocates at risk at our institutions. And we can host those people only for 1 year or 2 years at our universities. But by creating this into a network of scholars in the Indo-Pacific region as a whole, we actually can help each other when we have to end the hosting term at one university. Then that person can go somewhere else, and those NGO network can give us the information as to who are at risk, and so who should be hosted.
That's right. We've talked a lot about the government's role, right, in foreign policy, but of course the private sector is extremely important. Universities, think tanks, companies, NGOs. They can do some things that governments can't in some cases, because of course a government, whether it's Japan's or anyone else's, has to get along with lots of different countries which don't always share your values. So you might not be able to bring in these values conversations into your diplomacy, but the private sector sometimes can.
Right.
Isn't that right?
Right. Yeah. And that's really crucial because democratic recession, meaning that especially the fact that it's happening at the time of this geostrategic competition, is that those democratic countries that are working together, for example, to support Ukraine or to tackle environmental issues or economic security issues or what have you, have to help each other. Makes it difficult for us to criticize human rights violations or repression in each other's countries. So that limits governmental role, and this is where the civil society actors can actually play a role.
Yes, right. And also, Professor Hosoya, of course, the Keio Center for Strategy is part of this nexus of private sector institutions that are involved in these issues. You also look at government policy, though. Yeah. Where is the right balance between, for example, practical diplomacy with authoritarian countries that's designed to achieve important goals, like, for example, getting cooperation from China or other actors in climate change, and the need to support democracy, which these countries aren't always on board with?
Well, on these affairs, I always feel that civil society must be empowered, and of course, think tanks are going to and trying to empower those civil society. And I think that the Keio Center for Strategy is also trying to empower civil society to know more about what's going on in the world, because sometimes it's very difficult to access to some of the materials and the knowledge is about what's going on in the world, like in Ukraine or in Russia or in the Middle East as well. So that's why we are gathering experts, of course, like Ichihara-san, in this program to try to enlighten people to know more about international relations. But at the same time, I always feel that Japan has a little bit more robust democracy or stable democracy than the other countries' democracy for some reasons. And we are immune to some of the influence operations, unlike in other countries. Number one, because of the language. Sometimes the Japanese language can be a barrier to those attacks, because if we are using English, it's much easier for those who try to penetrate into the society. And also in Taiwan, they are using Chinese, different kind of Chinese, but for Chinese people in mainland China, it would be easier for them to use their language to try to influence people in Taiwan by exercising their influence operations in Taiwan. So language can be a little bit a barrier for us in Japan to defend our own democracy. And number two, we have relatively strong media, our quality media. In many liberal democracies, traditional media are facing serious problems, and less and less people are reading newspapers. But in Japan, huge numbers, maybe 10 times more, people are reading newspapers. Of course, these numbers are declining every year, but at the same time, those numbers are still huge. So many people still rely on traditional media in Japan. and they try to have information from those media. As long as those media exist, I think that the people can rely on some of the important information. But of course, these are not enough. People, particularly youngsters, are relying more and more on like YouTube and SNS and so on. And YouTubes and SNS, these actually spaces are much more vulnerable to influence operation. In a sense, we are trying to produce counterattack to defend rational thinking or rational understanding about international relations or politics by providing many programs or many commentaries to those media, new media like SNS and YouTube. These are what we are now doing. So in the sense, I think we need to provide reliable information to youngsters as well, who are relying on SNS and also YouTubes and so on. So combining these two things, traditional media as well as new media like SNS and YouTubes, if we can provide sufficient amount of reliable, rational information to these media, I think that Japanese democracy remains strong, I suppose.
And what about you, Professor Ichihara? Do you think Japan has some kind of natural immunity, or is it just, in a sense, on the same trend line as other developed democracies, just a little bit behind because its newspapers have such huge subscriptions? Yes, they're declining. It's not as noticeable because the absolute numbers are still big, but it's going in that direction. What's your view?
Well, as a person who has been conducting research on influence operations, I would always want to be cautious because, as I said, until something happens, we tend to think that we are not affected by influence operations. And yet, as Hosoya said, one of the strengths that the Japanese society has would be the relatively high trust in traditional media. And that would be because of the weaker level of partisanship amongst the media. Well, although we have been seeing somewhat greater, increased partisanship, and so this has been causing people to still get information from traditional media rather than getting information from friends and friends' friend via SNS and stuff. And also those countries that are strong subjects of influence operations tend to be the ones where people use SNS for a very long time. For example, in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, those Southeast Asian countries, people's average use of SNS is more than 10 hours a day. And so they tend to receive a lot of information from via SNS, including a lot of disinformation and fake. And that's not something that we have been seeing in the society. So those are some of the strength that the Japanese society has. Also, probably I should point out that, for good or bad, the Japanese society is relatively closed as a democratic society. We do not provide, for example, golden visa for the rich, wealthy people to stay in Japan, for example. It's so not too easy for them to, for example, purchase land and stuff like that. And so we have slightly less openness. But we also, of course, have to pay attention to the fact that those actors that are trying to spread disinformation and conduct narrative war campaign are aware of those strength that the Japanese society has. So one of the methods that they are using is to spread disinformation or manipulated information, not necessarily through SNS, but rather from aggregator sites, for example. In Japan, a huge number of people use the Yahoo Japan, for example, as the source of news. And so those diaspora media that know those Japanese consumption tendency try to have news, a news delivery contract with Yahoo Japan and try to spread their news with manipulated information through those aggregator sites. It's not only Yahoo Japan, but that has been the tendency. And also, we also have to pay attention to the fact that as Hosoya Sensei said, the advancement of technology is massive. And so we have, for example, those translation AIs like DeepL, which makes it very easy for external actors to actually translate from Chinese to Japanese or Russian to Japanese or what have you. And so, unfortunately, probably Japanese language would not be a barrier kind of cause anymore.
Yes, it's hard to see that lasting much longer. And in a sense, you're talking about this fundamental division and dilemma between openness and being closed, because open societies have a harder time defending themselves against misinformation, but closed societies are vulnerable to if people think that the media is too collusive and they're not getting the real story, they're going to look elsewhere, right? So it's that right. Balance, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are out of time. It's been a very stimulating and very timely discussion. I want to thank my co-host and commentator, Professor Hosoya, as well as our special guest, Professor Ichihara. Thank you very much, and goodbye.